Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Halper from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, here for my June update in terms of what is happening in Palestine, Israel, the region, and obviously the war in Gaza, or the assault on Gaza, or the genocide in Gaza is really utmost on our minds. And I want to talk just for a few minutes today about the rescue of the hostages that happened the day before yesterday. I'm recording this on June 10th, so this happened on June 8th. Because I think it says something about Israel and the whole nature of what's going on in Gaza. This was presented as a rescue attempt. There are about 120 some hostages. And here we have to differentiate, and this is important too. Hostages are civilian captives. And in fact, in international law, it's forbidden to hold hostages. Israel holds many hostages, hundreds of hostages, under what it calls administrative detention in Israeli prisons. Palestinians, including children, who are arrested and kept for indefinite periods of time. They have to come before a military judge every 6 months. It's almost an automatic confirmation, but they're held without charge, without trial, for as long as Israel wants to hold them. So, and these are civilians, Palestinian civilians, mainly of obviously of the West Bank, so that Israel holds many more hostages than Hamas does. Nevertheless, it is forbidden international law to hold hostages who are the civilians, and those were among the 4 that were rescued. I'm putting that word into quotes for reasons we'll talk about the other day. The other, and then there's about 120 some others that are being held. It's estimated that only about 80 maybe are still alive, but a certain number of those are soldiers. And Israel doesn't make a distinction between soldiers and civilians. When a soldier is killed, you have his parents on TV and you show his high school graduation and he was a wonderful kid, or she was, so that whole distinction of soldiers and civilians gets lost. So it all becomes terrorism. Because in international law, oppressed peoples do have the right to resist. Armed struggle is legal, but it has to be within the framework of international law. And in international law, it is permitted to attack and kill and capture soldiers. I mean, this is a part of warfare. This is what happens in all wars, is prisoners of war. So in a sense, we have to make a distinction between those captives that are soldiers that are being held legally in international law, according to the laws of war, and the civilians that aren't being held legally. So Israel got intelligence, apparently, that these hostages are being held in this crowded refugee camp in the center of Gaza, and planned this very elaborate military operation, which is presented in Israel as being heroic and one of the most amazing military feats in history. And all the soldiers are heroes. One of them died, one soldier, but it's a heroic effort. And of course, the hostages are back, and everybody's happy, and so on. They're singing in the streets. In fact, as we know now, probably up to 300, if not more, Palestinian civilians were killed in this so-called rescue attempt. In other words, Israel sees this as a rescue attempt. I think we have to see it as a war crime. This was an absolutely planned war crime in which Israel knew According to the way it was planning it, this is the center of an extremely crowded refugee camp with a large market, right in the center, and it's a place of refuge, so it's very crowded. And they decided to do it in the middle of the day because they knew that Hamas would be less expecting a military operation in the middle of the day. So they knew that it would be crowded, and they knew that there would be massive civilian casualties. So, in other words, you cannot justify a rescue attempt of four, illegally held Israeli hostages, at the price of more than 300 killed, and something like 700 or more that were wounded, and not to mention the traumatized and the kids and the families and the physical destruction. I mean, you see craters because this refugee camp and market, to get to the two apartments where these four people were kept, it was attacked by the Air Force, and by ground forces and by tanks and artillery. I mean, it's massive destruction in a civilian area. This is not in any way a military area. Now, of course, Israel's always arguing it. Well, Hamas is embedding itself in the civilian population. We have to remember, which is not a good thing, but we have to remember, that Israel has created conditions in which the Palestinians have to resist. Had the Palestinians been the Viet Cong, and they had a whole country, and that country had mountains, and it had jungles, and it had all kinds of areas where you could do guerrilla warfare, and you could separate yourself from the population, that would be one thing. But Israel can't take refugees. Don't forget, 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees from inside Israel. So take a population of this little place of Gaza. It's 35 miles long. That's all, and just a couple miles wide. Take this little tiny area with an original population, a population now of about 2 million more refugees, crowding them all into this area, besieging them for 16 years, and not expecting them to resist. They have to resist. That's built in. Well, Gaza is not a place that where you can separate yourself from the civilian population. And in a sense, it goes almost back to Mao's idea, that the guerrilla has to be like a fish in water. The question isn't really separating yourself from a civilian population, which is impossible. And if we try to apply that rule strictly, it would mean that Palestinians have no right to resist. They can't resist. And they simply have to live under siege with no water, with Israel providing basic foods because the people can't feed themselves, no access to the sea, even to fish, forever. They have to doom their children forever to this kind of a condition or resist. So if they resist, it has to be from within a civilian population. There's no choice. The question then is, are they supported by the civilian population or not? And all the indications are, look, I can't speak for Palestinians, and certainly I can't speak for people in Gaza. But the indications are by the polls a really kind of a mixed feeling on the parts of Palestinians. The further you get from Gaza, the broader the support is for the Hamas action. On the West Bank, 75% of the Palestinians support the Hamas, which they see as resistance, of course. It's not that they agree with the Hamas program. Very few people actually agree with the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic idea of an Islamic state. But Hamas is nevertheless the last resistance force, especially since Fatah has largely given up the fight. So that's why I think the Hamas action is respected. But as you get closer into Gaza, of course, the people are very conflicted. According to the polls, if you can take a poll in the middle of this genocide, today only about a third of the Palestinians apparently support this Hamas resistance action of today, even though Hamas has been elected, to be the governing power in Gaza. And people are obviously conflicted between their own lives and the tremendous destruction going on. And the question becomes, is the resistance worth it in terms of the destruction? And the question becomes, can you justify resistance in the middle of a civilian population and bring the civilians in where they have no choice, basically? I mean, these are really impossible questions to give definite answers to. But the whole idea that somehow Hamas is using civilians as human shields, and that's what makes them illegitimate, simply ignores the fact that it's Israel that has created the conditions in which they fight. And if there is going to be any resistance to what is going to be permanent apartheid plus genocide, those are the conditions that Hamas has to fight in, which is in the civilian population. And so far, at least, it appears that Hamas, it might be losing support at home, but so far Hamas has kept the support of the Palestinian people in terms of resistance. So it's an impossible dilemma to put people into: resistance to permanent apartheid and oppression and genocide, or somehow trying to preserve your family and your home and your community. So the fact that then Israel planned this military operation using as much military force as they could gather in a civilian area in the light of day in order to rescue 4 people is a war crime. It's a war crime. And it's a crime that Israel, of course, will not be held responsible for, but it's a part of the whole process of genocide that's going on. And I think it's important to put it in these dimensions. And of course, again, we always go back to settler colonialism. I think, as the framework for understanding why Israel is doing this, and why this is happening, and what Israel's goals are in terms of Gaza and the West Bank and the rest of Palestine. And settler colonialism sounds academic, and people don't like it because now it's become so commonly used as a word that it's lost its meaning. It's become flattened, and people say, well, it's a euphemism, or it's a mantra, or it's become a slogan, and that's unfortunate because, in fact, it really does mean something. And the only point I'm going to make about settler colonialism right now, to relate to what I've been talking about, is that genocide is built into settler colonialism. In other words, it isn't that Zionism itself is evil, but when Zionism adopted settler colonialism as its mode of settling and taking over Palestine, transforming Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish country by displacing its people and taking their land, it trapped itself into a genocidal kind of a campaign. There's no other way of taking over someone's country and getting rid of them, eliminating them, and replacing them with yourself without genocide. And the people can't agree to that, and that goes back to our resistance thing. The resistance is built into settler colonialism, indigenous resistance, because how can indigenous population not only agree to be displaced, to lose their country, to lose their heritage, but actually to be physically eliminated through genocide, both cultural genocide, but also, as we see in Gaza, physical genocide. So this is the problem. The war crime committed the other day in this rescue operation feeds into the genocidal process. And the fact that Israel was willing to sacrifice more than 1,000 Palestinians for the sake of rescuing 4 Israelis, really gets to the crux of settler colonialism, the genocide that's built into it, and how Israel is able to carry this out without any disregard whatsoever for the people. Because in settler colonialism, you can't, the indigenous population plays no role. This is unilateral. We are taking over the country, and we make up a whole narrative of why we're entitled to the country, and the indigenous people have no role to play whatsoever. They don't count. And add to that then their criminalization, because what Israel has done, with the help of the United States and Europe, is to criminalize Palestinian resistance. It's terrorism, right? So you put those things together, the dehumanization of the indigenous population in general, that makes you able to see yourself as moral, but still eliminate them as you take over the country, plus the criminalization of their resistance. And so all of these issues begin to explain how Israel gets away with it, because it puts it within this framework of criminalization and terrorism, and of us as the human beings and them as the non-persons on the one hand, and on the other hand, what we have to do as we push back is to really repersonalize the Palestinian people, re-emphasize their right to resist, and then show the logic of their resistance. And in order to show that rescues are in fact war crimes. And I think that's my basic message. This is the reframing that has to happen. A rescue means that we're buying into this entire settler colonial genocidal kind of a framework of looking at things. If we're able to see this as a war crime, then I think we're beginning to understand what's happening. I'll leave it at that for today, and we'll talk more next month. Be well, everyone.